What would you do if you were escorted out of a building you had given 6 years of your life to, in front of 40 people, by a woman who had waited a very long time for the pleasure and heard her open champagne in the glass office behind you before the lift doors closed? And 11 days later, the most feared man in that company walked back into the country, looked at the empty desk outside his door, and asked a question that turned the whole floor to ice. "Where is she?" That was all he said. 3 words, in a voice nobody on that floor had ever heard him use. And the woman who had fired her, who had rehearsed a great many clever explanations, discovered that she had prepared for the wrong conversation entirely. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman dismissed in 11 minutes by people who had no idea what she held, and of the ruthless man who came home to find the most important person in his company gone. Priya Raman had been executive assistant to the chief executive of Rock Holdings for 6 years and had been, in the language of that building, nobody. She was 32, soft and generously curved, with a warm, calm face, and beautiful in the specific way certain people are entirely unable to see, which is to say she had been told, since she was 15, by relatives and colleagues and one memorable careers advisor, that she had such a lovely face, and had learned exactly what the rest of that sentence was. She made that building work, and the people who ran it thought of her the way you think of the electricity, which is to say not at all, until the moment it stops. What none of the executives who walked past her desk 20 times a day ever understood was what Priya actually held, because Priya Raman was the memory of that company, not metaphorically. For 6 years she had run the chief executive's diary, his travel, his approvals, and every meeting that went into or out of that office. She knew who had been in a room, who had asked for a meeting and been refused, and which directors booked rooms under other people's names. She held 6 years of it, partly in a system, mostly in her head, and nobody had ever once thought of it as a form of power. It was, they would have said, administration. And on the morning everything changed. While the chief executive was 3 time zones away and unreachable, a woman named Fiona Devereaux called Priya Raman into a glass office and fired her. It was done properly, which was the clever part. There was a folder, 2 witnesses, and phrases about restructuring the executive support function, and about how these decisions are never easy. And there was a clause in Priya's own contract, buried in a document she had signed at 26, allowing the company to terminate senior support staff with immediate effect, provided a payment was made, and Fiona had found it, used it, and timed it for the 1 fortnight in the year when the chief executive was crossing a continent with no reliable signal. 11 minutes to end 6 years. Priya did not argue. She did not cry in that room, which she was proud of afterward, and did not make a speech. She asked one question, whether she could say goodbye to anyone, and Fiona Devereaux said security would prefer a clean exit, and smiled with a warmth that did not reach any part of her face. And so Priya Raman walked out of a building she had given 6 years to, carrying a box with a dying plant and a photograph, past 40 people, who all found something extremely interesting on their screens. And behind her, before the lift reached the ground floor, somebody in the glass office opened champagne. Fiona Devereaux was the reason certain floors had temperatures. She was the group operations director and had spent 2 years in a quiet campaign to make herself the indispensable one, and had understood correctly that the greatest obstacle to that ambition was not another director. It was a woman on 38,000 a year who sat outside the chief executive's door and knew everything. But Fiona had not done it out of ambition alone, which was the part nobody would understand for another 5 weeks. She had done it because a man named Curtis Vandermeer had asked her to, softly over a very good lunch, and made clear that a great deal of goodwill would flow to whoever solved a small administrative problem for him. And Fiona, who thought she was being made a partner in something, had been made an instrument. Nathaniel Rook was the reason the whole building had a temperature. He was tall and broad and dressed in charcoal, cut with lethal precision, had built Rook Holdings out of nothing over 22 years, and was known in that industry as a man who did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself, and did not forget. He landed at 6 in the morning after 11 days in 3 countries, came straight to the office, walked out of the lift onto the executive floor with his coat still on, and stopped because the desk outside his door was empty. Not unattended, cleared. The dish where she kept paperclips was gone, and the photograph, and somebody had put a spider plant on it. He stood there a long moment. And then Nathaniel Rook turned to the floor, 40 people at their desks, all of whom had stopped typing, and said, in a voice nobody in that building had ever heard from him, "Where is she?" Fiona Devereux came out of her office at speed with a folder. She had prepared for this. She had a narrative about restructuring, and one about performance, and one about modernizing executive support, and she got 11 seconds into the first before Nathaniel Rook said, quietly, "I am not asking why, I am asking where." And when it became apparent that nobody in that room knew where Priya Raman was, because nobody had asked, Nathaniel Rook did something the company would still be talking about years later. He cancelled the day, including a call with a bank that had taken 4 months to arrange. Then he went down and asked security for the exit footage for the 11th, and watched, 3 times, a woman he had worked beside for 6 years carry a cardboard box out of his building past 40 people who did not look up. Then he asked for her address. He did not go that day. He sent a letter, which she read standing in her kitchen with her hand shaking, saying that he had learned that morning what had been done in his absence, that he knew an apology from an employer is worth very little, that he would come and see her wherever she chose or never contact her again if she preferred, and that either way her salary had been reinstated from the date of her dismissal. Whether she set foot in that building again or not, she made him wait 4 days, the most satisfying decision of her adult life. When she agreed, she chose a cafe near her flat rather than the office, and arrived first, and watched the most powerful man in that industry come in wearing an overcoat, and look around for her with an expression she had never seen on him, which was uncertainty. He did not sit down until she said he could. He said, "I have 3 things to say, and then I will listen as long as you want." The first was that he had read the paperwork, that it was legally competent and morally repulsive, and he did not intend to defend anybody. The second was that in 6 years, he had never once told her what she actually did for that company, and that this was his failure, not hers. And the third was a question, and it was why he had come himself. He said, "In the 11 days I was away, did anything happen that made you think you were fired for a reason other than the one you were given?" And Priya Raman, who had spent 4 days turning exactly that question over, put down her cup and said yes, there was one thing. And then she told him, and he did not touch his coffee again. It had been a diary conflict. That was the entire thing that had cost her a career. 9 days before she was dismissed, Priya had been reconciling the quarter's executive travel records, a routine and profoundly boring task she did every 3 months, and had found a discrepancy. Curtis Vandermeer, the director of strategic partnerships, had claimed for 4 meetings in another city with a company called Halverson across 5 months. And Priya, who held that diary in her head, the way other people hold the alphabet, had known instantly, without checking, that on 2 of those dates he had not been in another city at all. He had been in the building. She knew because he had asked her personally on both days whether she could squeeze him into the chief executive's schedule, and she had said no, and he had been rude about it. She had not thought it was fraud, only sloppiness, and had done what she always did, which was to raise it politely, in writing, so it could be corrected before it went to finance. She sent that email on a Tuesday. She was fired 9 days later. She had not connected the two things until she was sitting alone in a flat with no job and 11 days of nothing to do but think. Nathaniel Rook sat with his coffee going cold in front of him. "Say the dates again," he said. She said them. All four, from memory in order, with the times. And Rook, who had spent 22 years reading people, understood two things at once: that his company had a problem considerably larger than 4 expense claims, and that the woman across the table was the most valuable person in that building, and he had spent 6 years walking past her desk saying, "Good morning." He asked her to come back. She said no, for a week, and meant it, and what she finally said was the thing that changed the shape of the entire affair. "I am not coming back to sit outside your door." And he said, "I was not going to ask you to." It became a different job entirely. He created a position that had not existed, gave her the title of Director of Executive Governance, which she chose herself and found faintly ridiculous, and gave her in writing the authority to see everything, and announced it to the company in a note that named her, described exactly what had been done to her, and stated that those responsible would answer to the board. And Priya Raman walked back in 8 days later, past the same 40 people, in a very good coat, carrying nothing at all. She unfolded over that spring in a way that startled everyone, including herself. She stopped saying sorry at the start of sentences and started running meetings rather than minuting them, and was better at it than people who had done it a decade, because she had spent 6 years watching every one of them. And Nathaniel Rook, who was not a warm man and did not become one, began doing something his executive team found genuinely unsettling, which was asking her opinion in front of them and then changing his mind. Every evening, after the building emptied, they ended up in his office with a decanter of amber whiskey he poured for himself and a pot of tea he made badly for her, and he told her about the 22 years and the marriage he had lost inside them, things he had said to nobody. He learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want a very calm conversation with a careers advisor from 2009. And one evening at the lift doors, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and he said, "Tell me to stop." And Priya, who had been the electricity in that building for 6 years, said, "Do not." And he murmured good night into her hair, "Care," and went back into his office and got nothing else done that night. But Priya, being Priya, had not stopped pulling on 4 dates, and it was about to become very much worse than expenses. The cruelty came at the spring investor reception, and it arrived in a beautiful dress and a rehearsed smile. Fiona Devereux had not been dismissed. That was deliberate, at Priya's own recommendation, and Fiona had spent 6 weeks believing she had survived, which was the most useful possible thing for her to believe. She found Priya by the tall windows with an audience assembling. "Oh, the assistant," Fiona said brightly. Loud enough to carry, "Sorry, the director." She let her eyes travel over Priya's body with theatrical sympathy. "It is a wonderful story, and everyone loves it, and I want you to enjoy it while it lasts. But we both know what that title is. It is an apology with a salary attached." He felt guilty and made you a job out of thin air, and there is not a person here who thinks a girl who was answering phones in February is running governance in April. She smiled like a blade. Nobody looks at a woman your size and sees an executive. They see a very well-compensated embarrassment. The temperature by those windows dropped 20 degrees. The old Priya would have absorbed it and found somewhere to stand alone. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right that I answered the phones," Priya said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect clarity. "For 6 years, which means I booked every room, arranged every car, approved every travel claim, and put every person in this room into a diary at some point. Which is how I know, Fiona, that in the 11 days before you fired me, you had 4 meetings with Curtis Vandermeer booked under the name of a colleague on maternity leave in a 9th floor room with no camera, 6 years of administration. I know where everybody in this company has been, so be careful how loudly you tell people I was answering phones. The silence had teeth. Fiona Devereux went the colour of the tablecloth and left the reception within 4 minutes. And Nathaniel Rook, who had crossed the floor without hurrying, took Priya's hand and put it through his arm in front of 200 investors and said, to everybody at once, "This is the person who found it. You never make yourself small in this company again, KR." But past Fiona's shoulder, a man in an excellent suit had gone very still, because the woman he had removed from that building in February had just recited, in public, the booking history of a room he had chosen, precisely because nobody watched it. The man was Curtis Vandermeer, and he had made one error in 3 years, and it was the smallest error a man in his position can make, which was to claim for a hotel. For 3 years, Curtis had been running the most profitable arrangement of his life, taking money from a competitor called Halverson, in exchange for the Rook Holdings deal pipeline, the projections, the target lists, the walkaway prices, everything that makes a bidding war winnable, and meeting them in person because he was not a fool and understood that nothing goes in writing. He covered those meetings as business development trips, which was almost perfect, because that is the one category of expense nobody in any company examines closely. Almost perfect, because on 2 occasions his own diary betrayed him, and the only person in that building who would ever notice was a woman on $38,000 a year who reconciled the travel records every quarter and remembered, without effort, that he had been standing at her desk. She sent him a polite email about it on a Tuesday. And Curtis Vandermeer read it and understood with total clarity that a competent, unremarkable, unpromoted woman had put her finger on the exact seam of a 3-year fraud, that she did not know it yet, and that he had perhaps a fortnight. So he took Fiona Devereux to lunch. Curtis smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Priya brought it to Rook that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, in order, with the calm of a woman who had spent 6 years being the only person in a company who could find anything. She had not gone hunting for a fraud. She had gone hunting for a reason which is different, and he took her to the room bookings, and they took her somewhere she had not expected. Curtis Vandermeer had been careful about his diary after February, and had stopped booking anything in his own name. But he had not been careful in the 18 months before, when nobody was looking, and Priya Raman had 6 years of the executive floor's booking data and a memory that did not let go, and she went through it the way she went through everything, completely. 11 meetings across 18 months, in rooms with no cameras, booked under 4 colleagues' names, every one within 3 days of a competitive process, in which Rook Holdings was beaten to an acquisition by Halverson, sometimes by margins so fine that Rook had privately assumed a leak. And the last of those 11, she said, and this was the part that made her cold, had been booked on the 9th. 2 days before she was fired, she laid it out on his desk without drama, in order, the dates, the rooms, the names, the deals. And Nathaniel Rook went very still and then did the thing that undid her. Completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask twice and did not send it to anybody for verification, and afterward she understood that this was precisely the point, that a man who had failed to ask one question in February would never fail to listen to her again. He looked at a case built entirely out of room bookings, assembled by a woman his company had escorted out of the building with a cardboard box, and said quietly, "Curtis, yes, said Priya. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at you, because there is no email and no recording, and the only thing on earth connecting him to those rooms is 6 years of a diary that lives in your head." And neither of them knew that Curtis Vandermeer had already made that decision. The office went dark at 9:30 on a Sunday. Priya was there because she had been there every Sunday for 6 weeks, assembling 18 months of records, and the floor lights went off on their timer and the building went into night mode, and she thought nothing of it until she heard the executive floor door open, which required a card, on a Sunday when nobody was in the building. She did not scream. She did not hide under the desk. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had at 7 in the morning when 4 things had gone wrong before anybody arrived. And Priya Raman did the thing no one in that company, friend or enemy, had thought to account for, because they had all made the same mistake for 6 years, which was to assume that a woman who runs a building does not know how the building runs. She knew where every camera on that floor was. Having arranged their installation, she knew the 9th floor room had none, because she had booked around that fact for years. And she knew because she had set the system up herself when the fire officer insisted on it, that the executive floor's access log recorded every card swipe, in and out, and was written not to the local machine, but to an external compliance server nobody in that building could alter. And because the person who specified it was a competent, unpromoted woman, nobody had consulted about anything since. She did not run. She walked to the print room, where the wired line ran on its own circuit, and made one call to the only number she had ever needed. Then she went back to her desk, turned her lamp on, and sat down in plain sight, because she had worked out something in 4 seconds that she would not have understood a year earlier. He was not there to hurt her. He was there for the files, and a man carrying a story about a distressed former employee cannot use it if she is sitting calmly under a lamp having already made a phone call. He came through the double doors and stopped when he saw her sitting there. "Priya," said Curtis Vandermeer pleasantly. He had a laptop bag and a lanyard he should not have had. "Working late. It is Sunday, Curtis," she said. "Scatty." "I will be direct," he said, "because I have always liked you, and you have always been very good at your job. There is a folder on this floor containing 18 months of room bookings and a set of conclusions you have drawn from them, and if it goes to a board, it will destroy a great deal more than me. Give it to me. Take the payment. Go and be an executive, somewhere warm, and be honest with yourself. Do you want to spend 2 years in a legal process where opposing counsel introduces you to a room full of men as the assistant who was fired for underperformance in February, and Priya Raman, sitting under a lamp in an empty building at 9:30 on a Sunday, did the one thing he never expected, because she had never been the harmless thing he took her for? She smiled. "There is no folder on this floor," she said. Silence. "It went to the board's audit committee on Thursday," she said, "and to external counsel on Friday, and there is a copy with the regulator, and none of that is what should worry you. What should worry you is that you used a card to enter this floor at 9:17 on a Sunday evening, and that the access system here writes to an external compliance server nobody in this building can touch. I specified that system. Curtis, nobody asked why I wanted it off-site. Nobody has asked me anything in 6 years. You spent 3 years being careful never to put one thing in writing, and 11 minutes ago you wrote the only sentence that ever mattered, which is that you were here." Curtis Vandermeer said nothing at all, which was the closest thing to a confession she would ever get. And in that silence the lift doors opened, because Nathaniel Rook had left his house 11 minutes earlier and driven across the city like a man possessed, and behind him came 2 of the building's security, and, more calmly, a woman from external counsel carrying a phone with a recording running. Time seemed to fracture, and Rook crossed that floor and did not look at Curtis Vandermeer at all. He went straight to the desk with the lamp on it, put both hands on it, and said, "Are you hurt?" "I am fine," said Priya. "Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "He did not touch me," she said, steady. "Even now, he offered me a payment and a job somewhere warm, and I have his card swipe at 9:17, and counsel has the last 90 seconds on the telephone." She let out a breath. "I would like it noted that I did not have to do anything except sit here with a light on." And Nathaniel Rook laughed once into the silence of an empty floor, a sound almost nobody in that company had ever heard, and went round the desk and knelt beside her chair in front of counsel and security and the man he was about to destroy, and put his forehead against her shoulder. Curtis Vandermeer, who had smiled at Rook Holdings for 11 years while selling its pipeline to a competitor, learned the price of underestimating her over the following 2 years, which is how long the proceedings took. Rook did not act in blind rage. He let Priya present it in her own voice, without notes, to the audit committee, and then to counsel, and eventually to people with statutory powers. 11 meetings across 18 months, in rooms with no cameras, booked under the names of 4 colleagues. The whole thing anchored by the diary of a woman who had been walked out of the building with a cardboard box. And when it was put to her that she might press for the maximum, she said mildly that she did not need to make a martyr of the man. She needed to make him nothing, and that the difference mattered. So they did it her way. He lost the role, the shares, the industry, and a great deal of money. And what followed him was not the criminal matter, but the story which went round that sector within a month, and was always told the same way. The Curtis Vandermeer, who was so careful, was undone by the assistant he arranged to have fired. And there is no coming back from being that anecdote. As for Fiona Devereaux, who had opened champagne before the lift reached the ground floor, she was not permitted to resign. Priya was extremely clear about that. She remained for the full length of the investigation in her role on her floor, while every person in that building learned exactly what she had done and how little she had been paid to do it, and she left 11 months later with no reference and no settlement. She had believed she was a partner. She had been an instrument. She spent a long time afterward explaining at parties that she had only signed the paperwork. A year later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Mafiaromance stood at the head of a board table presenting a governance framework that would be adopted across the whole group, and not one person in that room thought she was an apology with a salary attached. She wore rich colors, cut to celebrate every curve she had spent 32 years being told to disguise. Nathaniel Rook came in at the back and stopped, simply to watch her work. "You are staring," she said afterward, without looking up from her papers. "I will never stop," he said, crossing to her. "Do you know what I understood the morning I came off the plane?" he said quietly. "Not when I saw the desk. 40 seconds after, when I asked 40 people where you were, and it turned out not one of them had asked." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "For 6 years, everybody here walked past the most capable person in the building 20 times a day and saw furniture. KG and I was the worst of them, because I benefited most and never once said your name out loud in a meeting." Priya looked up at the man that entire industry was frightened of, who bowed to nobody, and yet knelt that Sunday beside an office chair, and for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 32 years being told she had such a lovely face, and 6 years being the electricity in a building full of people who never thought about the lights, and she had proven every last dismissal wrong, because the thing they all called administration turned out to be the only complete record of the truth that company had. A woman opened champagne before the lift reached the ground floor. 11 days later, a man walked in off a plane and asked where she was. And by the time either of them understood what she was, the assistant they had escorted out with a cardboard box had 18 months of room bookings, a card swipe at 9:17 on a Sunday, and the whole company in the palm of her hand. If Priya's story of hidden worth, quiet competence, and hard-won recognition moved you, if something in you sat up when the boss walked onto that floor and asked where she was, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this with someone treated like furniture at a place that would collapse without them. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Priya's story?